Welcome everyone. King's Politics is delighted to be joined by Femi Oluwole. Femi Oluwole was a political activist, well known for his opposition to Brexit and his pro-Remain stance. He has written for numerous articles, newspapers from The Guardian to The Independent, and has contributed to multiple media appearances from Good Morning Britain to Sky News. Thank you for joining us.
Hi.
Just to start off, I just want to ask, how did you go from being a law graduate to a political activist?
So basically, I studied law because I like to argue, and I figured it was the best way to arm that skill. Then realized I didn't want to be a lawyer around September first year, and so I figured, all right, if I don't like the rules, how do I change the rules? And that means policy. And so I figured, all right, I'd use my French language skills to move towards a whole EU human rights direction. Started working in Brussels for about 2 years, working in human rights, focusing on the human rights abuses in the Gulf states. So I was working for an NGO called the European Centre for Democracy and Human Rights. So we focused on the armed cells of Saudi Arabia, which are being used to bomb Yemen, the fact that the UK trains Bahraini police, which then go back to Bahrain and then torture and arrest human rights offenders. And I was working with British members of the European Parliament to try and stop that, push for an arms embargo, push for better human rights policy. And so I was involved in what I already believed to be a battle for the soul of the UK before I'd even heard of the word Brexit. So that was late 2015. Then the word Brexit came up, and I occasionally kept looking an eye at what was happening on that conversation, because I wasn't massively involved or focused or engaged in UK politics. But I watched this conversation, and it was bad. Not only was I terrified at the notion of the people who I was already fighting against in terms of human rights abuses getting more power, because I worried what the Tories would do with complete freedom on human rights, and we're seeing that now. But also just because nobody was explaining the basics. And when you've studied EU law, when you've worked alongside the elected members of the European Parliament, and you're hearing back home people think the EU is a dictatorship, when you're literally working alongside its elected representatives, you know there's a problem. And so I started trying to shout as loudly as I could with my 20 Twitter followers at the time.
On the topic of Twitter, your activism has taken quite a digital format with your extensive reach on Twitter. How important has platforms such as Twitter and social media been for your reach and making sure your voice is heard?
Oh, it's been essential. TikTok's slightly better in the sense that it's really democratized the ability of anybody to get their opinion out there. But Twitter has been it has been the lifeblood of everything that I've done over the past 5 years. So I was on Facebook pretty much a lot of the time, and I always told myself I'll never do Twitter because Facebook already takes up too much of my life. If I take on Twitter, then I'll have no life at all. I was correct. And so I've just been on that just day in, day out, pretty much. It's easier to count the hours that I'm not on Twitter.
Just to on the topic of Twitter, the Conservative MP Steve Baker recently blocked you. For those who don't know, what unfolded between you two?
Well, he's actually number 6. I did the count last night of number 6. He's the 6th Tory MP to block me. He tweeted that because Poland and Germany had declared the national sovereignty of their courts and parliaments, that meant that somehow Poland and Germany had declared independence and they'd taken back control. So I mentioned to him that because the UK case law says that all UK law is to be interpreted as if it's consistent with EU law unless the UK Parliament specifically and expressly decides to overrule it, which means the UK Parliament was still sovereign whilst we were in the EU, which means the UK took back control at least 20 years before the referendum, which means his entire referendum campaign for Brexit was based on a lie. I pointed that out to him and cited the cases, and then he blocked me 2 hours later. He has referred to himself as a champion of free speech and a Brexit hard man. This was not in keeping with that, in my view.
On the topic of Brexit, in recent months we have seen shortages across numerous industries, as well as perhaps a demand of labour. Has these issues sort of vindicated your views on your pro-Remain stance and opposition to Brexit?
It's the start of the vindication. That vindication is going to come over a very long time. I remember I've said this before, on the 24th of December last year, when the deal came out and I realized it wasn't going to be a no deal, it was going to be a deal that was damaging bit by bit over time, I actually cried because my mind just saw forward to the next 10 years of drip, drip, drop of damage to the UK, be it food shortages, be it damage to loss of jobs, be it apparently releasing raw sewage into the waterways. I knew that there'd be bits and bits just over time, and that it'll be just this ongoing conversation, and no individual single thing will be enough to make people turn. It's going to be the accumulation of those things over time, which is going to be a very arduous and painful process, but that's where we are.
In the longer term, are you more optimistic or pessimistic about the future of Britain as an independent entity of the EU, especially in relation to, say, economic competitiveness and perhaps even the Union?
So in the long term, in the context of if we're in the long term and staying outside of the EU, no, I'm not confident at all. I think the shortest way I've explained why Brexit can't work is in 5 simple points. 1, all countries trade most with the countries that are physically closest to them. That's why there's the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the NAFTA agreement, the African Union. 2, the biggest barrier to trade is having different regulations, having to adapt your products to the laws of different countries. 3, put 1 and 2 together, that means that it will always be in the UK's economic interest to have similar laws to the rest of the EU, because they're closest to us. 4, that means that the only thing that is guaranteed with Brexit is that because we're no longer members of the EU, we no longer get a say on those laws. 5, given that the main reason why people voted for Brexit was to have more control over our laws, that means we're permanently trapped in a position where we have to choose between following the rules of the EU over which we no longer control and annoying Brexiteers, or having different laws to the rest of the EU and intentionally damaging our economy. That's the choice that we're stuck between permanently for as long as we're outside of the EU. As far as my optimism in general, I'd say that, well, you look at the election in 2019, 52% voted for parties that were committed to a second referendum, which means that we have a progressive majority. In fact, if you look at every single election since the Second World War, it's only 1955, 1958, and 2015 where the majority didn't vote for parties to the left of the Conservative Party. So we are a progressive voting country and have been for a literal lifetime. Unfortunately, our first past the post voting system doesn't allow that to reflect in Parliament. So I have hope in the sense that I know that people do not want what they're seeing in Parliament, and that has to change at some point because, as I said before, to use the words of Martin Luther King, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice, and that's what's coming.
Do you see in the future a prospect of the UK rejoining the EU eventually?
I think out of pure economic necessity and as I said, the progressive and internationalist attitude of people in this country in general.
In terms of the Tory government specifically, tomorrow King's Politics will debate as to whether Boris Johnson made the best out of a difficult situation in his handling of the pandemic. What would you argue towards those who say that this situation was unprecedented and the government did the best they could?
I'd say that there's lots of situations where you can say, it was a difficult situation, it was hard, unprecedented, we didn't know what was going to happen. But there are a couple of just key moments and key elements where you cannot deny something went horribly wrong, and it's down to Tory ideology. 1, at several points during this last 18 months, the Conservative government has said they've struggled to do what was necessary in terms of locking down because they didn't think that people would accept it, because Boris Johnson said twice, we're a freedom-loving country, which means that he believes that the UK would prioritise this notion of freedom over our actual welfare. What was the message of this government for the past 5 years? It was, we don't need to listen to experts. It was, we don't need to follow the same rules as other countries. It was, we can pursue freedom with no personal cost. What did they have to tell us during the pandemic? You have to listen to experts. You have to follow the same rules as other countries are following. And if you pursue personal freedom, your grandparents will die. Kind of a bit of a U-turn they had to make in very little time. So it's not surprising, not to mention the fact that it was the 3rd of February in 2020 last year when Boris Johnson stood in front of, I think it was an economic forum, World Economic Forum, and he told the world that he wanted the UK to effectively have the loosest response to COVID of any country. He said that while other countries are throwing up barriers, we need some country to take off the Clark Kent spectacles and emerge fully charged as the supercharged champion of free trade. His ideology crippled us. And then to skip 5 COVID meetings and then come out and then attend one on the 2nd of March, and the next day when Sage is telling people not to shake hands, tell people that it's okay to shake hands. And then we've just found out in the report that that failure to lock down around about that time cost about 20,000 lives. No, I can't say he did his best.
In terms of attributing liability to the government, do you think that plays into the government's hesitance to conduct a review?
Yes, I'd say that the government's track record with the notion of reviews is we have to conduct them and release them in ways that don't damage us. That's why they decided to take 8 months from the Black Lives Matter protests last year to when the report was actually released, and basically saying, don't worry, we'll give you a report, just wait. And so it takes the sting out of the fire that was burning last year. And then we waited 8 months to deliver a report that the UN said normalizes white supremacy and talked about slavery as if it was a cultural exchange. So the attitude they have to reports is not usually one that's conducive to progress.
How do you assess the way in which the government's handling the pandemic right now, in terms of there seems to be an easing of restrictions and reluctance to impose them again?
As far as the pandemic in terms of restrictions right now, I'd say that right now we have a new variant of a variant that's been identified in the Delta. We have the British Medical Association saying that we need more restrictions, and we have 50,000 cases a day. Under those circumstances, it is crazy to not do anything. I'd say that if you can, and this is the main principle throughout the entire thing, if there are things that you can do which don't really have any downsides, but can potentially have an upside, in a pandemic where we don't know what's going to happen and we're not entirely sure, you do them. Basic common sense, given what's on the table. And mass and public transport are one of those things that there's no economic damage. You do mass and public transport, people will still take the bus. They're not going to stay away from bus because people are wearing masks. People will still take the bus. And it's necessary. It's different to nightclubs, where people choose to take that risk to go into a nightclub. But people don't choose to need to go to work. People need public transport. So having mass and public transport is just an absolute basic. And not doing it now, I think we're going to pay a price for that.
You mentioned previously about the electoral system. Just how important is the electoral system to the Tories being able to form a government in the previous election and in the election in the future?
So the way I phrase it simply is, if 40% vote Tory in any constituency, 30% vote Labour, say 30% vote Green, that means you've got 60% voting for left-wing parties and 40% voting for a right-wing party, yet the right-wing party will win in that constituency. If that was repeated in every single constituency, then you'd have 100% of MPs in Parliament being Tory, despite 60% voting for left-wing parties. That system is broken. As I said, the majority has voted for parties to the left of the Conservative Party in all but 3 elections since the Second World War, and yet the Tories have been in power for 46 out of the last 76 years. Mathematically, that means that we have had a government that's more intolerant than our people for a lifetime. So the first past the post system, because there are fewer parties on the right, helps the Tories as a result. The only way I can logically see a change of direction is via Labour committing to proportional representation, which unfortunately that failed in the last conference, but now we've had a new union. The members wanted PR, the unions didn't, but now one of the major unions, Unite, has now backed it. If Labour commits to PR, then that's the key point that will allow Lib Dems and Greens to vote Labour as a way to make all future votes for the Lib Dems and Greens actually count in all future elections. Because right now, Tories got 44% of the vote and 56% of the seats. Labour got 32% of the vote and 31% of the seats. When you do the maths, that means Tory votes are worth 24% more than Labour votes and 18 times more than Green votes. So one would ask the question, how can you solve a climate crisis when Tory votes are worth 18 times more than Green votes? So that is what you need to fix the problem. You need a new voting system.
Is the change in the vote system a necessity, or do you think Starmer can turn around in the current first-past-the-post arrangements?
I'd say that we've never seen Labour come back from the kind of defeat that we saw in 2019. It would be unprecedented for them to do that. The fact that with 150,000 people dead, the Labour hasn't already jumped across the Tories in the polls suggests that they're not going to in any time soon. So I'd say that it is unrealistic to do so, not to mention there is the Einstein principle of insanity, whereby repeating the same thing over and over again and expecting different results is insanity. And as I just said, if every election has had a majority for progressive parties, yet the majority of the time you get Tory governments, it was not statistically wise to keep rolling that dice.
With the recent murder of Sir David MS, what do you think about the current discourse of amongst politics about toxicity in politics and what needs to be done about it?
I'd say that, to tie off of the last point, it does link directly to PR. I know that might seem like a far-fetched link to link electoral reform to murder, but the system we have now of first past the post, it means that in any given constituency, you'll have people with different views. I mean, the idea that there's just two sets of views in the country is madness. Lots of different views in the country. But under first past the post system, in your constituency, only one view gets to win. Only one view gets any representation at all, because you only have one MP that's elected in any constituency, which means that every other viewpoint is an existential threat to your own. Either you get yours or they get theirs. Unlike a proportional system, whereby if you had multiple MPs elected per constituency, it would obviously be larger constituencies, so you don't have like thousands of MPs, then it means that the proportional share of MPs will be based on the vote share, which means you'll get multiple views able to be expressed. But right now it is kill or be killed in the political sense. So I'd say that until we get rid of that, we're going to still have that sort of really confrontational nature of politics. I'd say that in terms of the discourse, I'd say it's obviously gotten worse and worse. I mean, it was crazy to see a Tory councillor, I forget his name, the day after the murder, saying the first word out of his mouth when he was asked how the conversation has gotten worse was Brexit. And I cannot but go back to what Boris Johnson said in 2019, when we had death threats against MPs, when we had, I know that I was technically, in the technical sense, assaulted at least twice. We had harassment of MPs. We had, what was it, the wake of Joe Cox. And MP after MP was begging Boris Johnson to stop using such coarse and confrontational language in his discourse, including the successor of Joe Cox. And Boris Johnson's response was to tell them the best way to ensure that every parliamentarian is properly safe and that we dial down the anxiety in the country is to get Brexit done, which translates to the best way to ensure that you don't get death threats, that your life isn't under threat, is to support this policy, my policy. Now that idea that support my politics or die doesn't exactly scream utopia to me.
Following the death of David MS, Mark Francois made a comment in Parliament arguing for the implementation of what you refer to as David's Law to sort of far more regulate discourse towards MPs. How does one mediate between sort of discouraging abusive language but also ensuring freedom of speech?
So I think that it is important to draw the line between incitement and insults. Insults are obviously bad. I think that we head down a dangerous path when we start to say that insults should be automatically removed, depending on, of course, on the nature of the insult. Some insults go so far as that they essentially infer incitement, like calling somebody vermin implies that they are something to be eradicated. Similar, I'd say, to the word scum, so that's why I avoid the word scum. But I'd say that the attitude that the Conservatives seem to have towards free speech, for example, in that speech, Mark Francois was saying how he wants David's Law to make it illegal to, quote, vilify MPs, which means you can't accuse them of villainous behavior. Now, for a government that's sitting on top of 150,000 dead British people to say that it's illegal to say that we might not have the best motives when we know that they've been found by Transparency International to have a bias towards giving the contracts to their own mates, it seems little at odds. It seems like an attempt to use this tragedy to protect themselves.
Do you think Brexit will continue to be a salient aspect of political discourse as the years continue, or will it be something that gets stepped aside?
It can't. I mean, it legally can't. For example, in 2026, fish has to be renegotiated. So that's when because right now we've got roughly the same amount of fish in terms of quotas as we had before Brexit. That only gets negotiated properly to get a new share, which is what Brexit was supposed to be about, in 2026. Now, the EU's already said that if we were to ask for a larger share, then that would come with a cost in terms of our access to the EU, which means essentially throwing up the whole debate around tariffs again, which means renegotiating the deal. It means it just can't end. It doesn't end. Not to mention all the projects that we have to now undertake because we're no longer working on these things together. One of the examples that I often use is the Galileo project, which cost 8.4 billion to set up by the EU. The cost was split between 28 countries. Now we plan to do it by ourselves at a cost of 5 billion. So the whole 350 million pounds a week on the bus thing to the NHS never really made sense to me because we're spending more. That sort of thing is a sort of ongoing project and the ongoing negotiations. And one of the things that I've said before is people voted for 44% voted for the Tories on the basis of getting Brexit done because of the Brexit fatigue. This is not done. In fact, if every vote had counted equally in that election, then there would have been a second referendum, and that referendum, according to Labour's manifesto, would have taken place in September. And given that that would have been a referendum between soft Brexit, which nobody wanted, and Remain would have won, and Brexit would have actually been done over a year ago. So this is not done, and it won't be done until we rejoin the EU.
How would you argue against the Brexiteers who argue that referendums are in reality binding and they can't actually be overturned? And there seems to be a really strong opinionated argument that one should not overturn referendums.
Let me give you an example of a legitimate referendum. The Good Friday Agreement, signed in 1998. Before that referendum that was signed, they negotiated it, sent a copy of that agreement to every single voter in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and then they had a referendum having seen the deal, having seen the new relationship between the UK and the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. We did it the exact opposite way round. We had the vote, and then 3 years later they gave us the deal, which is equivalent to signing a contract that has 4 words, leave the European Union, and then having the other side of the contract add an extra 700 pages of terms to that contract you signed, and then claim to have your consent already. It was never a legitimate thing. Not to mention the notion of referendums being legally binding does not exist within our constitution because it's not written. This is one of the biggest ironies about Brexit. Ultimately, the notion of leave and remain, that was made up by the people who pushed the referendum. This is international law. It's just about treaties. What treaty defines our relationship between the UK and those other 27 countries? Remain just meant the EU treaties, as recently modified by the Lisbon Treaty. That's what it was. Leave meant literally any other relationship. So the idea that it was democratic to scrap a deal that was voted for by 16 million people in favor of one that was voted for by nobody, and that essentially gave Boris Johnson a blank check to write our new international status in the world, and claim that to be democratic, i.e. one man has all the power versus 16 million people who voted for something specific, a specific alternative, it's a farce.
With the treatment of, say, protesters during the Sarah Everard vigil, as well as the passing of the policing bill, do you see perhaps the pandemic opening up an opportunity for the government to reassert authority and take perhaps some more authoritarian measures?
Yeah, I'd say that there is a risk that with us being used to essentially our freedoms being not fully there, not being fully exercised, that we allow ourselves to sleepwalk into a much more authoritarian state of affairs. I think that often, at several points during the year, the Tories have tried to imply that this policing bill is to protect us from COVID when it's a long-term situation, and that's why they're limiting protests. They even used the violent minority in the Black Lives Matter protest last summer as justification for the policing bill. Now, the policing bill, it says that police can impose restrictions on any protest, which can include saying that you can't be noisy enough to put anybody in the vicinity at risk of serious unease. Now, serious unease is a completely subjective measurement, which means that if, theoretically, a protest is happening outside Parliament, somebody inside Parliament who's writing a law that is going to destroy people's human rights, take away their fundamental needs and welfare state, etc., feels uneasy by being shouted at for the actions they're actually undertaking. They can tell the police, I'm being made to feel seriously uneasy, and the police can impose that restriction. And if the people don't shut up, they can be fined up to £2,500. That is a ridiculous attack on free speech. And I am very, very worried about what happens if that goes through, because the Tories have been very clear they want to take rights away from us. They're anti the Human Rights Act, etc. But if we lose the right to protest, it'd be difficult to get those rights back.
I just wanted to explore the case of Sarah Everard a bit more. You've made some comments about the case, about sort of the onus being put more on men and sort of holding other men accountable, and emphasizing that it's an issue of male violence as opposed to female responsibility. Yep. Can you expand on what changes we need to make as a society in terms of that?
I think one of the things that people... So often this notion of political correctness gets used as a weapon by people to say that we're too sensitive and that language doesn't really matter. But language does matter. Language is it's how we characterize people and things. And this morning, on Good Morning Britain, Richard Madeley was asking Keir Starmer about whether or not, basically his thoughts on Angela Rayner, and he used the phrase, "Is she still your best girl?" Now, the infantilization of women contributes to the sexism that has other consequences. If you treat women as girls, you treat them as somebody who doesn't have full agency, and therefore their notion of consent is undermined. And yes, I know that's a stretch, but it's all part of a society. When you look at the fact that we have a society where there are 97% of women have experienced sexual harassment at some point in their lives, when you look at the fact that we have a society where barely 1% of rape cases ever see a courtroom, you know there is a problem. So you have to start looking at what is it about a society that allows these sorts of things to happen. And often when I say things like men need to look out for other men need to keep an eye on what is meant by those jokes that their friends are telling, what are their friends' actual attitudes, not just write everything off as, oh, he's probably joking. Often I get a backlash of, well, who are your friends? Your friends must be horrible. Your friends must all be rapists if you're thinking that this is how men have that. No, because, sorry to use an internet meme, but there's the Cher Lloyd little girl singing, and the woman comes in and says, she's already got it. Everyone says, like, I haven't got any bad male friends. He was fucking one of yous. And that's the point. If the numbers are where they are, we know that a significant number of men are doing this, and that you are likely to have one male friend who is a problem. So we all have that responsibility to speak to each other and make sure that those jokes are jokes and they're understood to be... A punchline is often funny because we recognize its absurdity. So you need to find out whether or not your friend is making that joke because he actually agrees with the punchline or because he knows it's morally absurd.
So in terms of that issue, another aspect is the role of the police. Of course, the police, a lot of females have lost confidence in the police to do their job, but also extends to other groups such as various minorities. What do we do as a society about the police? Do we need institutional change? Do we need to rethink the role of the police? What are your thoughts on this issue?
I think in terms of trust in the police, obviously we have a significant ways to go. I'd say that I think one of the things that struck me in terms of just how the law needs to be stronger is last year, shortly after the Black Lives Matter protest, in fact it may have been even during, a child, a 13-year-old boy, Hugo Boateng, was on a charity bike ride with his father, and he was chased down by police and nearly tasered because he matched a description. And that description was IC3 on bike, and that translates to black male on bike. Now, it was a charity bike ride. There were lots of people biking, which means essentially the police description was find a black guy. The idea that that can be a description that warrants stopping somebody is insane. So there definitely needs to be safeguards that prevent this sort of discrimination. As far as, I think there needs to be better de-escalation training, regardless of the protected characteristics of the suspect, so that police do not go in with force immediately and try and de-escalate the situation rather than aggravate it. When I remember seeing Patsy Stevenson face down on the ground at a vigil that was in response to a police murdering a woman, there is work to do.
I wanted to touch upon race in Britain as well. Of course, a government report came out which stated that institutional racism did not exist.
Of course.
And as you sort of pointed out, government reports don't tend to give the most progressive views. How do we approach the role of race in Britain in terms of inequality, systemic inequality, both in its discourse and explained to opponents, as well as the changes that need to be made?
So often people in the Black Lives Matter are accused of not having any concrete asks. My 3 concrete asks are, 1, we need to have better history training, history education. I know that me personally, my history education was World War I, World War II, Cuban Missile Crisis, history of medicine in the UK, Industrial Revolution, and I think that's about it. So essentially, stories of the military and scientific achievements of white people. That was it. So it's not a surprise if every story that we hear as kids are stories of where the UK are the good guys and the rest of the world are either enemies or places to conquer, that we have a problem of British superiority. I think that's something that needs to change. We need to have a more well-rounded view of the world from other perspectives, not just our own. I would also say that number 2 is, given that study after study has shown, and in fact one from Oxford, sorry to mention that here, shows that they sent out 3,200 job applications to various sectors, and they changed only the name, and they found that if you have a Southeast Asian name, you have to send 70% more job applications to get a call back. Nigerian, it was 80% more, and Middle Eastern was 90% more. So that's, given that they're only changing the name, that shows that bias is systemic. One thing that I would really like to see, therefore, is blind CVs, either mandatory or use tax incentives to make it more advantageous for employers to use them, because that doesn't just address race, it also addresses discrimination based on gender, region, class, and I think that would be a really good step. Third thing would be electoral reform, because, as I said, given what I've already said about the weighting of Tory votes versus Labour votes or Green votes, it also means that black votes count less, because statistically black people are less likely to vote Tory, people from ethnic minorities are less likely to vote Tory, so we have a situation where ethnic minority votes count less, so you need to create a more fairer voting system.
This is the last question before I want to hand it over to the audience. As a political activist, what do you hope to accomplish in the next 10 years? And what advice would you give to the political activists of the next generation who want their voices heard and want to make a change?
What I want to see in the next year is people right now, they're watching the politicians get away with everything under the sun. They're seeing our country in a very bad state. They're seeing lies left, right, and center, corruption left, right, and center, and they feel apathetic, not because they don't care, but because they think there's nothing that can be done. And the reason there's nothing that can be done is because they know that they vote what they believe to be the right way, and nothing seems to change. And the reason for that is because of our voting system. Because even though the majority votes one way, it consistently goes the other. And so I think that the way we get people really, really engaged is by finding a way to make people know that their engagement in politics will actually change their lives. I remember going to school after school during the campaign, speaking to 16, 17-year-olds, and the first question I'd ask is, who here cares about politics? And almost all the time, I'd get maybe 1 or 2 hands going up. So the next question I'd ask would be, who here cares how much stuff costs in the shops? Who here cares whether or not you can get treated with the NHS? Who here cares whether or not you get a job when you leave school? All the hands go up. I say, that's politics. And I was just like them, arguably worse, because I didn't care about politics at that age either. For me, I was born in Darlington, grew up in Birmingham. Politics was just it was just old men shouting at each other down in London, hundreds of miles away. I could not see the link between that and my life. So I think people need to know that politics affects their life and know that they can change politics to get a better one.
So I want to hand it over to the audience now. If anyone has a question, please put your hands up. I'll start with the bloke on there.
Wait 1 second, I'll just get a microphone. So if I throw this to you, and then you throw it back, and then it'll record it for the audio.
That's a hell of a mic.
Is it working? I mean, there's something.
Yeah, it's working.
But I just want to ask your position on hotel quarantine. Hotel quarantine in January and February of this year. A traveller in the UK coming home from South America, from the UAE, from large swathes of sub-Saharan Africa, you were forced to pay 1.8 grand to stay in a hotel for 10 days, given mediocre service. And I worry sometimes that's part of an anti-immigration rhetoric. We know Boris, we know the Tories, that anti-immigration. And that's them using COVID protests to have an excuse for anti-immigration rhetoric. In the same sense, that's what they did in Australia, that's what they did in New Zealand, America, and China as well. And I'm wondering if you see the link between these sorts of COVID policies and, I guess, anti-immigration, racist rhetoric, especially people saying, there was someone saying, I think it might have been Boris, it might have been a professor on stage saying that you getting these foreign bodies bring people to our shores with new disease. And I'm wondering if you see that rhetoric between COVID and like these border controls and stuff.
I've definitely seen bits of that rhetoric. I would say that, ironically, they've been less anti-immigration than I'd say was epidemiologically necessary during this period. I think that given the fact that travel was cut down to almost nothing, holidaying was cut down to almost nothing over the past 18 months, I think if we put everywhere on the red list and required everywhere to have the hotel quarantine, we've gotten control of this virus significantly faster. I think that's what the experts were advising as of about middle of last year. And yes, they may have xenophobic motives behind it, but the epidemiology pointed that way as well. It was ironic that they actually just resisted it on the basis of going against science for some reason. So I'm going to start on one side. I'm going to say that it is a difficult position to be in, to be the leader of the opposition during a pandemic, especially after the years that we've just had. So Keir Starmer was coming out of not only just the leadership election, but also 5 years of everybody in politics being at each other's throats. So if it felt in any way like the Labour was just continuing that sort of aggression in politics as we were heading into this crisis, and we needed to have one message, we need to all do this, then it would have seemed like petty party politics and taking advantage. So I can understand that basis of not being particularly vocal and constantly critical as a principle. However, I struggle to see how he hasn't managed to cut through in just the sheer number of deaths. So I think that is I do think that is a significant failure. As to why he's failed to cut through, I'm not sure. I'd say that he has. I think there's been he has gone too quiet on a number of issues. Not to mention he hasn't put his foot down on this is what I would do as much as he needed to. There's been lots of situations where he's just said Tories are doing the wrong thing, and there's been an interview where he's been saying, all right, well, what would Labour do? And he's been kind of quiet on that. I think that is problematic. He's gotten better at it, but it's still a problem.
Thank you. Lovely to be here with you today, Femi, and thank you for listening to me. So my question is about the blatant hypocrisy of the politicians that we've witnessed during the pandemic. As a society, we've seen the double standards of Dominic Cummings and Matt Hancock. And we've also seen a general lack of political accountability. So my question is this: does the perceived weakness of political accountability mean that we should perhaps look at legal accountability to have some repercussions for politicians behaving badly and not abiding by the law which they themselves created?
I'd say that legal accountability for these sorts of actions, it's necessary. The question is, I remember what happened when people were trying to use a legal route during the Brexit campaign years, so 2016, 2019. And it was very easy for the Tories to spin it as Labour just trying to play games with lawyers, etc. So if you start down the legal battle, it may damage the political fight. And so that is a balance that needs to be struck. I think that the main problem is, when I look at the fact that the courts didn't rule that Boris Johnson had abused his office when he had the £350 million a week bus thing, even though that was proven to be a lie, and it was known to be a lie, and even at the time he used a different figure, which means he knew the actual figure, shows that our constitution isn't strong enough. And I think we need a written constitution so that this kind of misbehavior does come with real consequences. And I'd say the written constitution needs to include things like enshrined human rights. It needs to include PR, obviously. It needs to include a settlement for Scotland that Scotland actually wants, because we've screwed them over pretty hard. If you think about the fact that Scotland voted to remain in the UK after being threatened that by David Cameron, that if they voted to leave the UK, they'd be forced out of the EU, and then 2 years later we dragged them out of the EU. So they effectively voted to stay in an EU country twice in the space of 2 years, yet they're still out. So I think we need a written constitution for that, and for political accountability as well, because right now I don't think we've got enough.
Thank you.
Just going back to a referendum, especially in the media, it's portrayed as sort of like a Tory civil war between Remain and Cameron on one hand and Boris and Leave on the other, and it was a blue-on-blue contest. How much do you blame the lackluster effort from Labour, and especially Jeremy Corbyn, on this like media portrayal, one, and two, the end result?
So wait, repeat the last 5 seconds, sorry.
How much do you blame Jeremy Corbyn and lackluster campaigning for the referendum?
Mm-hmm.
And two, the media portrayal of Brexit as a blue-on-blue civil war?
So I'll hit the second point, and this is my counterpoint. So I understand the principle of, I've been told that Jeremy Corbyn found it difficult to essentially get on a stage next to David Cameron because it was portrayed as him being the face of Remain. So for Jeremy Corbyn to get on a stage next to the man he believed he held responsible for austerity, I can understand why that would be difficult for him. And that's pretty much the only defense of Jeremy Corbyn that I'm going to give. Because I remember, and I've got a Facebook post about this from January 2016, and this is me barely paying attention to UK politics at all. I was a dunce. Most of my family think it's crazy that I'm involved in politics because of how little I knew before 2015. But from the very little I was paying attention to, in 2015, late 2015, I was in love with Jeremy Corbyn on the basis of I worked for an NGO that focused on human rights abuses in the Gulf states. So, and he was one of the loudest people saying, let's stop selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. So I was a Corbynite in 2015. By January 2016, I was basically saying, where the hell is he? And it's not just that he wasn't, I'm not saying he wasn't involved in the debate, it's that his arguments were crap. The argument about taking back control, that's the basis of we need to control our own laws, British laws for British people, etc. And also we need to be richer by a Brexit. That argument is so easy to destroy because if the EU doesn't exist, you have 28 different countries making their own laws in their own ways. So if you wanted to sell a product to 28 different countries, you'd have to make it comply with 28 different sets of regulations, which would send your costs through the roof. So because the EU exists, there's one set of rules to follow, which means you can keep your costs down, consumer prices down, quality of life for the citizens of the EU higher. That's the single market, explained in 20 seconds. David Cameron and Jeremy Corbyn had 4 months to do it. And I did not see an explanation that simple once. It was their job. It wasn't mine. Pretty much everything I do is because the politicians and journalists aren't explaining things properly. And they were the ones that pulled me off the bench and thought, oh crap, I have to get involved in this. And if you look at, in terms of Brexit actually happening, again, do the maths. If you take the period of January 2016 to December 2019, maths, from January to June, Labour was anti-Brexit. From June to around about September 2019, Labour was saying that Brexit should go ahead, and then it was then after that they then campaigned for a second referendum, which means for 80% of the time where Brexit could have been stopped, Labour was pro-Brexit. And look where we are now. And there was no way Brexit could work as a socialist, because if you know what people want from Brexit, they wanted to have more control over their laws. And if you leave the EU, but you don't have different laws to the rest of the EU, you will cause damage to the UK economy for the reasons of the regulatory barriers, the extra red tape, etc. We've seen small businesses go to the wall since January. But if you keep within the EU's rules, you have less sovereignty than you had as EU members, which is the exact opposite of what Brexit voters wanted. So there was no way to do Brexit in a way that both pleased Brexit voters and didn't betray the working class people that Labour is supposed to represent. That is again, I've just explained that in 20 seconds. That's something that that's a conclusion Jeremy Corbyn should have come to almost immediately. 3 years it took him. He campaigned against the policy he ended up running on for 3 years, and then supposedly it's the second referendum campaign that was the problem. I have some feelings on this issue.
How do you think, so you think that it's sort of inevitable that for economic reasons alone that the UK will need to rejoin the EU at some point? What is the political path to get there? Can Labour run on to the next election? How do we get there?
I'd say that, if you take the question separately, I'd say Labour's policy right now needs to be not we will rejoin the EU, not we will scrap the Boris Johnson's bill, but just take the ideology out of it and just say, if there's any part of Boris Johnson's bill that we believe is hurting British people, be it the farmers, be it the fishermen, we will fix that. Just be really precise with the target, because Tories can argue against that. Because Labour can just say, no, this farmer here, this British farmer is suffering, I'm going to help him. What are you going to do? And you won't get a backlash from that. And you can basically just walk that. And of course, we get to 2024, the more people will be harmed by Brexit. And so it is going to be easier to take a more at the very least, single market stance by that time. However, I'd say that the overriding factor is what happens in terms of that electoral pact, because I do not see Labour leapfrogging 10 points over the Tories between now and the next election. So it's ultimately going to have to involve cooperation, which means that if you do get a massive swell of traditional Lib Dem, Green and Labour voters, that EU policy could right itself.
You spoke in favour of proportional representation, and you said that Labour
So Labour, the UK did not vote against proportional representation in 2011. In that election, we were given a choice between first past the post and alternative vote. Now, proportional representation is a system which has multiple member constituencies. So there are multiple potential MPs that come out of every constituency. So if we were to do it now, we'd probably group multiple constituencies together, and so that you can divide up the MPs per party based on vote share. Alternative vote basically means you get a second choice. But there's still only one MP that goes through, which means you still have a situation where millions of votes simply don't count. So the UK has never been given the option of a voting system where all votes count equally. So there is no issue of rerunning a referendum because we were simply never asked that question. The irony is, it's a similar sort of problem whereby both of those referendums were used to manipulate the public. That referendum was used to essentially allow people such as yourself to say, no, we've already voted on electoral reform, we're now going to go our own way. The referendum was used to say, no, they voted to reject this EU treaty, therefore we're going to write our own, and whatever it is will be the will of the people. That's how referendums can often be used as a tool of manipulation. You either put a rubbish option compared to status quo, which was 2011, which is alternative vote, or you put a completely undefined option which soaks up the majority of votes in the EU referendum.
Any more questions, anyone? So I think we'll wrap it up at this point. So can you put your hands together and thank Femi for joining us?